First, I want to say thanks for coming and appreciate your guys' attendance on the panel today. I'm David Bitkower. I'm a partner in Jenner & Block in our Washington, D.C. office in the Investigations, Compliance, and Defense practice. And prior to joining Jenner & Block, within the last year, in fact, I was at the Justice Department for a little over a decade in a variety of roles at the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York and then down at Main Justice in the Criminal Division headquarters where I supervised, among other things, the FCPA program. And all the way on the right is Ann Perry, who's another Jenner & Block partner, also in the Investigations, Compliance, and Defense practice based here in New York City. Ann and I will be the co-moderators for today's panel. And now I'll introduce our three panelists and give you a sense of what our goals are for the session and our hopes for audience engagement and participation in that. So immediately to my right is Katie Chu. Katie's the Chief Investigative and Anti-Corruption Counsel at GE, General Electric, a post she has held for 7 years. Katie specializes in government and internal investigations and compliance initiatives, and she has primary responsibility for counseling GE's businesses with respect to anti-corruption efforts related to the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, as well as other anti-bribery laws. Katie's been at GE since 2003, so over a decade, and prior to that was an assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York. In the middle is Kevin Fox. Kevin's the Senior Vice President and General Counsel and Corporate Secretary of Sharp Electronics, and he's been with Sharp for also over a decade. As General Counsel, Kevin leads major internal investigations and is responsible for the compliance and internal audit functions at Sharp. When he joined the company, he was one of two lawyers, him and the General Counsel. Now he is the General Counsel, and prior to joining Sharp, Kevin was in private practice. And then further to my right is Mara Davis. Mara is the Senior Vice President and Associate General Counsel and the Chief Compliance Officer at Univision Communications. Mara is responsible for developing, enhancing, and overseeing Univision's corporate compliance program. She's developed and implemented compliance programs on anti-bribery and anti-corruption and related areas. Prior to joining Univision, which was about 5 years ago, is that right? Mara served as senior compliance roles in other organizations, including Bertelsmann, NYU, as well as the government of New York City. So we have a wide variety of compliance and investigative expertise focusing on anti-corruption and other areas from different industries, and our hope is to bring all that out in the discussion today. What we're going to do quickly is we're going to ask each of the panelists to describe a little about the companies they work for and the corporate culture of those companies. We're then going to do a brief detour into FCPA basics and FCPA recent trends, just to make sure we're all dealing with the same vocabulary and starting at the same point for the discussion. And then we have a couple of topics that we're going to discuss with the panelists regarding, number one, how do you develop and implement a compliance program based on the particular culture of your company and the challenges it faces based on its industry and its culture. Number two, how do you tell if the compliance function is working? How do you measure that, and how do you make changes if you don't think it's working? And then if we have time, also questions about how you approach compliance in different areas of the world where you're complying with both the FCPA and potentially local laws as well. Our hope is that we'll obviously have a discussion among the panelists, but we really invite participation and questions from the audience as well. So instead of just waiting to the end for questions, at the end of each section, if there are questions, people should feel free to raise their hands, and we'll also solicit some of those questions. So please be engaged, and please don't be shy to speak up if you have any questions about any of those topics. So with that, I'll turn to Katie first to talk a little bit about GE and the general culture of the company as it relates to these topics. So thank you.
Thanks for that, David. We're going through a lot of change at GE if you've read the paper recently. But one thing I am really relieved and proud about is I think the culture on compliance remains very strong. I think it'll be challenged during challenging times, as one would expect, and I expect we'll do well there. On this question of corporate culture, I find it really interesting because we do have lots of different businesses within GE that are very diverse, very different. So the question is each business culture materially different when it comes to compliance? If so, why? How do we deal with that? And from my perspective, I joined actually 15 years ago. And for decades before me and hopefully decades after me, hopefully hundreds of years after me, this company has had an overarching policy, procedures, and really dogma about compliance being led by leaders and needing to be owned by leaders. I have not seen that vary at all. So in that sense, I say there's a unifying theme, luckily baked in over generations before myself being there, and that every CEO from the time I've been there, our new CEO, drives from the top. So the tone is very strong. I think people understand that when they join the company. I'd say from my perspective, because we've been so acquisitive over the years while I've been there, once you do an acquisition, you're talking about integrating a new company into a very large company. And so how do you keep that touch and that theme? That's where I would focus on myself when I think about GE. And so I've been involved in a number of acquisitions where the focus really is on surge resourcing for that acquisition, determining what the culture is like, hopefully during the business development and strategic assessment period and the compliance assessment period, you're getting a very good sense of that. But you never know as much as when you're obviously owning the company. So once we own, how strong is it? How much needs to be changed? And just as importantly, like how do you integrate their good program into our program? Because you can't have competing programs. So you do try to collect the best from what you're acquiring, but also making sure that the fabric of the GE spirit and letter, the program part of it, is integrated into the acquired company. I'd say middle management is always, in some respects, the most challenged and the most challenging. So you can have buy-in at the top, but if middle managers who have to drive the commercial operations of the company, drive the revenue stream, drive the target meeting across that company as well as legacy operations, they're the ones who have the toughest challenge because they have bosses who want them to deliver. So are they cutting corners? Are they doing something that undermines the compliance culture? Because after all, in the end, the leaders are the ones who drive what's important for their teams. And if there's some wink and a nod going on somewhere, whether it be a specific region, country, industry, segment, function, that's where the weak link is. So that's what I would say about culture is there's no doubt in my mind from John Flannery today and stemming back to Milton for that Welch, the messages that I hear from them genuinely is compliance, you own it, and I expect the very most adherence to it and driving and leadership on that from you, the top leaders of the company within your businesses. And where I've seen people leave at senior levels in a compliance program or a compliance problem has been not so much because they're complicit themselves. I mean, that's extremely rare. It's probably true for all of us. But it's where they failed to create the programmatic support and culture within their particular business line, and they should have. And they're held accountable. So I think that is one measure of success for our company, and I'm sure that these two next to me will be able to share many more.
Great. Kevin?
Thanks, David. So I was actually wrestling with the whole corporate culture question because as I came down to it, part of what was driving it was the basic culture of Sharp in terms of it being a Japanese company. So Sharp Electronics Corporation is a U.S. subsidiary of Japan's Sharp Corporation. So the Japanese culture drives things differently and therefore drives the corporate culture entirely differently. Japanese, in my experience at the very least, have been very consensus-driven, meaning they like to get the management together, they all agree upon a plan and move forward, which sort of raises some problems. But the most problematic part of it is this general tenor of not telling your boss no, or not doing exactly what your boss said, or in the absence of very specific direction of what your boss said, to just do what you think is the right and or wrong thing to do, and then not necessarily report bad news up. Culturally, that presents a whole slew of problems. So now I'm a U.S. lawyer coming in. I have a very different idea of culture, very different idea of how you report problems up, what a person, basically I've just defined the exact opposite of a whistleblower. It's someone who won't tell their boss no or won't tell anyone else what the hell is going on. Sure, I shouldn't use profanity. And now I'm dealing with a legal department within Japan who they're not necessarily lawyers. They can be, but the legal department is housed by people who have gone to school and receive education in that art, but aren't lawyers as the U.S. people understand it. So culturally, it causes a whole slew of issues that you have to surmount, and doing so in a way which is consensus-driven, which from a compliance perspective isn't always the easiest thing to do.
Before we move on to Mara, Kevin, can you just describe your presence in the United States? Where are your operations? What are you responsible for in the American subsidiary?
So in the U.S., we're based out in New Jersey. We have probably about 45 offices throughout the U.S. I'm responsible for North and South America. We have operations in Canada. We have operations in Mexico. We used to have a lot more operations, direct operations within Latin America. Over time, as we've changed the culture, we've realized maybe pulling those people out is probably a better course. But we mostly deal with the U.S. operation, vendors down in Latin America for sales. So that, again, presents a different set of problems, but still something you have to be wary of.
Thank you. Mara?
Thanks, David. Good morning, everyone. So for those of you who don't know Univision, we are a large U.S.-based media company, and we are the leading media company serving Hispanic America. Our mission is to inform, entertain, and empower our audiences and the communities we serve. Our media runs across various platforms, which include broadcast, cable, digital, and radio. And our content includes news, sports, entertainment, and music. And that's really important in the context of our risk issues. When it comes to culture, a lot of our employees are either from Latin America or they have strong Latin American roots. And so from a so-called whistleblowing perspective, there's a historical and cultural reluctance sometimes to raise issues, and that really governs our approach to compliance. So we always aim to talk about compliance in a very sort of neutral and healthy way. We think about things like terminology. We avoid using words like complaints or concerns. Instead, we talk about inquiries. And we talk about giving people lots of ways to raise inquiries, whether it's through to your direct manager, whether it's directly to compliance or to our hotline or to our ombudsperson. We create a lot of opportunities, and we encourage people to engage in open dialogue as part of our healthy corporate culture. One of our key values is integrity, and we constantly talk about this in the context of the trainings and our compliance initiatives.
Great. And you have presence overseas as well?
We do. We're located primarily in Mexico and in Colombia, and we also have freelancers conducting news gathering activities and sports production throughout the world.
Great. Okay, thanks. Again?
With that framework of the various environments and cultures and the companies represented on the panel, we want to take just a few minutes and go through some high-level basics on the FCPA for those in the audience who may not be completely immersed in this every day. You could certainly do a full hour on just the FCPA law, but in lieu of that, we do have on various seats the Jenner and Block Business Guide to Anti-Corruption Law. We do it every year and do a mid-year update. So to the extent, obviously, we're happy to answer questions, but to the extent issues come up or if you want to refer back to it later, that has a lot of helpful information on the black letter law generally and some recent developments. So just to orient ourselves for today, what is the FCPA? The U.S. Foreign Corruption Practices Act makes it unlawful for certain groups of people and entities to make payments to foreign officials to affect the officials' act with respect to those persons obtaining or retaining business. There are interesting nuances on who is defined as a foreign official. It could include employees of a state-owned enterprise. There are 3 sets of provisions, types of violations under the FCPA generally. The first is the anti-bribery provision, what you might think of when you first think of FCPA. It prohibits, it's a direct prohibition on bribery, prohibits the offer, promise, or payment of anything of value to a foreign official with a quote-unquote corrupt intent to influence the official's action in obtaining or retaining business. Corruptly is defined as something done voluntarily with a bad purpose to accomplish an unlawful end or to accomplish a lawful end in an unlawful manner. That's the basic bribery, anti-bribery provision. There are 2 other provisions of the FCPA, one called referred to as the books and records provision, which is essentially a requirement that you accurately document the nature of transaction in a company's records. And the second, internal controls provision, which only applies to issuers, which are those who issue securities in the U.S. or who are otherwise required to file with the SEC. Requires an issuer to maintain adequate controls sufficient to provide reasonable assurance that the transactions are properly authorized and recorded, like under the books and records provision, and also to permit the preparation of financial statements that are in compliance with GAAP principles. Those latter two provisions, the books and records and the internal controls provisions, give the FCPA a broader reach in the sense that even where the government, this is enforced by both DOJ and the SEC, where the government cannot prove a bribe, if a payment has been documented incorrectly, so it could be a small payment that would otherwise not even necessarily rise to the level of a bribe. It might be under one of the affirmative defenses we'll talk about in a minute. But even if that payment would not rise to the level of constituting a bribe or the government cannot prove it's a bribe, if they can prove it's been improperly documented, it could be in violation of the books and records provisions. So the risks we're sort of mitigating for here and thinking about in terms of our affirmative compliance culture include how we document things, not just the payment of a bribe itself. Who is subject to the FCPA? As I mentioned, issuers are subject to all the provisions of the FCPA. Companies doing business in the U.S., so where their principal place of business is in the U.S., are subject to the FCPA. Anyone else whose principal place of business is not in the U.S., who is doing something in the U.S., is subject for the actions they take within the territory of the United States. Agents and employees of any of those entities. So agents can include third parties you've hired to take action on your behalf, subsidiaries of parent companies, etc. And U.S. persons who aren't even in the U.S. but are taking action exterritorially are also subject to the FCPA. And as is generally the case in criminal law, there's also conspiracy liability and accessory liability. So where there's an agreement to do something amongst people, you can be liable for the actions of the people you've agreed with. The penalties, we have them up here. The list of penalties under the FCPA on this slide are those for companies. There are also penalties for individuals. We don't need to go through all of them. They're significant. As I mentioned, the penalties for individuals are at a different level. Moving forward, defenses to FCPA prosecutions. So there are a few affirmative defenses or other defenses that commonly come up with respect to the FCPA. One is facilitation payments. So the FCPA does not apply to payments that are made to secure the performance of a routine government action. It's a modest payment, a payment you would make to secure or expedite a routine government action. Does not apply if whether or not to take the action is within the discretion of the government official you are making the payment to. It doesn't apply to a payment for an illegal action. There are two important caveats about the facilitating payments. The first listed up here, the payments could be illegal under local law. The UK Bribery Act, for example, does not have the exception for facilitating payments. The second is the one I referenced earlier, which is that even if it's a payment that would qualify otherwise as a facilitating payment, if it is improperly recorded as, a cost for pens, when in fact it's a payment to expedite an official action, that can constitute a books and records violation. Two other defenses, if something is lawful under the official formal written law of a country, that can be an affirmative defense to an FCPA violation, saying this is how we do this here, this is our local custom, is not sufficient. Reasonable and bona fide expenses, there's also an affirmative defense under the FCPA that an expense was a reasonable and bona fide business expense. We list here just a couple of comparable or potentially relevant foreign laws. This is by no means comprehensive, but just to keep in mind, and it's actually not also tailored to our specific panelist jurisdictions. I'm sure they have their own go-to foreign laws that they're most concerned about, which we may get to toward the end of our panel today. But in addition to the FCPA, the UK Bribery Act is a anti-corruption law we confront on a fairly regular basis, and does have some important distinctions from the FCPA, including the lack of permission for facilitation payments, the fact that the UK Bribery Act covers commercial bribery as a whole, rather than simply only payments to foreign officials, and the lack of a requirement for corrupt intent for a bribery violation. China has an unfair competition law, and Brazil's anti-corruption law. This is not a criminal provision. It imposes civil and administrative liability, but it applies to all public officials, so both domestic and foreign, and is a strict liability statute. So I'll leave it there as far as the black letter law and turn it over to David to speak a little bit about some of the current enforcement trends.
Sure. Thanks, Ann. So we just want to highlight a couple of things that have been on folks' minds about how the FCPA and comparable anti-bribery provisions have been enforced in the last year and a half to 2 years, particularly in the new administration. A lot of thought obviously has been given to it, and a lot of ink has been spilled about whether to expect changes or whether we've seen changes with the administration coming in particular, because there was a lot of attention paid to the fact that the current president had said some not favorable things about the FCPA in his prior life as a businessman. So how do we gauge whether the FCPA enforcement of today looks like what we've seen in the past 2 years? Typically, we look at statements of enforcement officials, and we look at the record of enforcement. On the statements front, we have a quote here from the Deputy Attorney General. Generally speaking, the Justice Department has been very clear that they intend to keep enforcing the FCPA at the same level and with the same aggressiveness that they have under prior administrations. As the Deputy Attorney General says in this speech, which was a few months ago, the FCPA is the law of the land, and we're going to keep enforcing it. And we've heard that from the Attorney General to the Deputy Attorney General on down to the folks in the criminal division who are primarily responsible for enforcing the FCPA. In terms of results, again, sometimes we have slides which show enforcement trends with graphs and line graphs and bar graphs and the like. I tend to think, and whenever I put them up, I always say they don't really mean that much, at least not yet. And that's because the gestation of an FCPA investigation tends to be measured in many months to years, and therefore what you have seen in the first year to 12 months of a particular administration is not necessarily reflective of the priorities of that administration. It's really more reflective of actions that may have begun years before. And so therefore you wouldn't necessarily start seeing wholly indicative products of enforcement policies under this administration for another year or two into the future. That said, we have continued to see individual cases being brought, perhaps even on a greater pace than before. We've continued to see corporate cases being resolved, and they look more or less similarly to corporate resolutions from prior years. So at this point, I think it's best to say continuity, but stay tuned until the future years and see how that plays out. And then finally, another area that I think that, at least personally, I think is more relevant, frankly, than those numbers and statements is funding and staffing of the enforcers of the FCPA unit, and thus far we have not seen major change in that either. In terms of the actual enforcement policy, here too we've seen continuity. In the last administration, there was a so-called pilot program, which folks in the audience may be familiar with, and that pilot program was designed to take into account corporate incentives and encourage self-reporting of FCPA violations by corporations by giving a more clear and definite sense of the incentives to self-report and the disincentives not to self-report. That pilot program was adopted almost verbatim into a new FCPA enforcement policy. There are some changes around the margins that we can talk about, or that certainly people have written about before. But as a general matter, the approach is, again, to focus on corporate incentives and to have a definite sense or a more definite sense of predictability in terms of what the benefits are for self-reporting and what the disincentives are for not self-reporting. We've also seen a continued focus on, and we'll talk about this hopefully in the next couple of minutes, but on the role of compliance programs. The role of compliance programs both in determining whether to bring charges against a company, the structure and nature of those charges, and of any resolution, and also looking at any changes in compliance programs when answering those questions as well. So those are the same areas that we saw some focus on in the prior administration. We see that continuing today. One difference is, and this may also come up later, the DOJ FCPA unit the fraud section as a general, brought in a compliance counsel. She actually spoke on one of the panels yesterday. I'm not sure if some folks may have seen her. Wei Chen, who was involved in helping to structure and to make the FCPA unit more sophisticated about compliance programs and give prosecutors who grew up in an enforcement culture a better understanding of how corporate culture works and a better ability to discern the difference between effective compliance programs and not effective compliance programs. That position still exists on paper, although it is currently vacant since she left the administration early last year. And so it remains to be seen whether that will be filled, but as a matter of the policies and principles, those same policies are applicable. Very briefly, one of the other trends we've seen over the past few years, and this seems to be continuing in the same direction, is increased cooperation between U.S. and foreign enforcement authorities, and that's an area which I think hopefully we'll talk about a little bit later also, but can be of concern and certainly should be on the radar of companies that are operating in other countries. If they see something, who will it be of concern to? Is their ability to report to one agency without it going to another, and the like? And those are issues that have been coming up more and more in the past few years. So.
Could I add to that?
Please.
The one thing I'd add to what David said very nicely about the revised or new policy, which effectively extends and continues what was started as a pilot program, I think there is one major difference. We'll see whether it's meaningful, because this is just written up in the U.S. Attorney's Manual as DOJ guidance the end of November, early December, right? I mean, I think this announcement was made on November 29th. There is a there's a presumption that a company that does all that DOJ wants it to do will get a declination. DOJ's never said that before. The pilot program never made this clear. If anything, the pilot program, which was started in April of the prior year, basically a year and a half ago, said you'll get gobs of credit, up to 50% for this amount of cooperation, 25% for this amount of cooperation, and there's one tagline in there. It's also possible you might get a declination. This policy starts by saying if you do the following things, you will presumptively get a declination. The question is, this going to happen? Because there are aggravating factors that are listed. They're not going to give a wholesale declination, I would think, putting on that enforcement headset. If it's a crime of the century kind of FCPA case, it doesn't make sense that they give you a pass if from top to bottom it's a totally corrupt institution with major corruption that has gone on systemically for decades, right? So that's obvious to me. I think it's probably obvious to you. But there are lots of cases that the DOJ has been prosecuting and the SEC has been taking enforcement action on where they have not declined, where in the defense industry there's been murmurs about self-disclosure, done all the right things. Why am I getting named in whether it be a DPA, NPA, enforcement matter by the SEC, and or, a limited quote-unquote charge, and the credit I get is in the amount of the fine, or how they compute the disgorgement, or what have you. So if you take the policy at its word, the notation, which is at the very beginning, it's not at the end, that says companies presumptively will get a declination, is very significant in my mind. The one thing that is also important to note, though, in getting a declination is you must still disgorge all profits. So there's a pain point there. A full declination is no longer a full declination in the sense of you walk away, you've done the right thing, and there's no pain. And secondly, it will be publicized. Historically, DOJ has looked for the company's assent before they publicize a declination. If a company does not assent to that, there's no public disclosure of the declination. It has resulted in a concern within the defense bar because all they see are the pronouncements of actual cases. Maybe they've been declining many, but since no one sees them, there's been the skepticism of whether the government has actually shown that kind of discretion before in a significant fashion. Now they're going to require declinations to be publicized. So that's also a pain point for a company that is trying to stay out of the press, perhaps, right? Do the right thing, clean house, have an effective compliance program, remediate, but you will have a headline coming out of the office of the FCPA unit. That is not necessarily what companies want, but I just wanted to add those 2 points to what you've said earlier.
So I think those are both really important points, and I agree with both of them. And I think it's actually an interesting segue to what we're going to talk about next, which is the written policy the new FCPA enforcement policy, which is now in the U.S. Attorney's Manual, as Katie points out, differs from the pilot program by having a presumption encoded into the policy. That is, if you self-report and follow these rules, you will presumptively get a declination. Now, when we talk about the difference between programs on paper and the people who enforce them, right, that's an interesting point because it's the same folks, of course, who drafted and enforced the pilot program who presumably took part in drafting and are now responsible for enforcing the enforcement policy. And so does a presumption on paper mean something different than the lack of a presumption on paper, but if it's enforced by the same exact people who are looking at a similar amount of cases? If you look back at the cases that were declined under the pilot program, you see, generally speaking, folks who would have fit the presumption under the current policy getting that declination under the pilot program. But again, as those personnel change over time, how important is it to have it in the U.S. Attorney's Manual and to have the new folks coming on be trained on what a presumption is and doesn't mean anything different than what you saw before? So I think it's an interesting point that maybe we'll get to in some of the discussion of compliance programs, that is, the people. How much does it matter it's the people who thought this up and wanted it to happen and have a goal, and how much does it matter encoding that presumption or encoding those rules into the manual, and does that actually have an effect, or do the new people coming in have different priorities and just see the word presumption in a different way? So, Anne, do you want to bring us to the second?
So toggling back from the enforcement land to thinking proactively from a compliance perspective, if these are the risks we're concerned about, how do we devise a program appropriately tailored for our clients or our companies that helps to mitigate these risks? An effective compliance program in and of itself is a critical factor that's evaluated by prosecutors in making decisions about whether or not to pursue companies for any kind of violation. It's a relevant factor in the sentencing guidelines. And focusing specifically in the anti-corruption context, we'd like to turn to our panel and find out what are the ways in which your anti-corruption compliance program and the relevant policies reflect aspects of your corporate culture. So I'll start to my near left with Mara.
Sure, thanks, Anne. So when it comes to our anti-corruption compliance program at Univision, there are a number of risks that we try to solve for. So, of course, there are the geographic risks. We operate in countries that are some of the most corrupt, as deemed by Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. We also work closely with a lot of third parties that may not be very sophisticated. So we work with third parties on co-productions, or sometimes we hire freelance third parties to help with our productions. And they may not have a compliance program, and they may not be well-versed in anti-bribery laws, either the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or even the newer laws in their respective countries. Also, sometimes we interact with foreign government officials, perhaps in the normal course of business, in getting a permit, or sometimes, they may approach our productions. And then we also have risks around new or under-enforced laws and historical and cultural issues around bribery. So that impacts how we tailor our program. And generally what I'll say is we take a very tailored, hands-on, and proactive approach just because of the nature of our employee population and because of the nature of the risk and the type of work that we do. We have very strong relationships with our senior executives, so we're well in tune with what the business is doing when it comes to activities outside of the U.S. and potential for risk. And they keep us well informed. When it comes to our policy, I think our policy is pretty plain vanilla, with the addition that we prohibit facilitation payments in our policy. So I think that's important. And then also, as I alluded to earlier, how we talk about compliance. We try to talk about compliance in a very sort of neutral, non-alarmist sort of way. We try to make people think that when you ask questions or you make an inquiry about anti-bribery, it's part of just, healthy dialogue within the company. What I think we do really well is on a regular basis, we train our at-risk employees. And then we conduct point-in-time training. And the point-in-time training is in close proximity to, say, a production or some other business initiative. And as Hui mentioned yesterday, she talked about the importance of skills-based training. And the skill that we teach our employees, as well as we also train our third parties, so our third-party partners in Latin America, we train them on this model called the RESIST model. It was developed by Transparency Transparency International, the United Nations Global Compact Working Group Against Anti-Corruption, as well as the International Chamber of Commerce. And it teaches people on steps you can take to proactively prevent bribery and plan ahead, and then what to do if you're in a situation. And that methodology has been very, very helpful for us. And we've actually had situations where we've had employees in jurisdictions and they followed the resist methodology, and we've successfully prevented improper payments, which we have documented. We also
Can you without
Sure.
being specific and not saying too much, can you walk us through like an anonymized version of one of those?
Sure. So, we've got a team going into a country in Latin America, high-risk country, going to do a news production, and we trained them right before they went in. We trained our employees. We trained the third parties. We focused very strongly on resist. So, it's things like plan ahead. If you're in a situation, you tell people who are soliciting you for payments that you can't make the payment. It's illegal. It's against your company policy. Your company doesn't allow you to do this. And then if this persists, you make the demand transparent. So you call compliance or you call somebody else. So our employees were about to go and film. They approach in areas of park, and they're approached by a government official, and the government official sees, this U.S. media company and says, you need a permit to film here. This is something new. We've never actually required anybody to get a permit to film here. The amount of money you'll have to pay will be hundreds of dollars a day. It's subject to negotiation. And our folks were able to identify all those red flags. And they went through the steps, and then they called us. And, in the moment type of situation where we had to respond. And so we actually wrote an email to the foreign government official, and we asked the foreign government official who was soliciting the improper payment to explain to us the legal basis for why they were making this request, potentially, give us a statutory citation, and we also asked if they could issue an official government-issued receipt. And then the next day, we got a letter of apology. We're so sorry. No payment is necessary, and you can proceed as planned. So I think that's an instance where the resist methodology, I think, is really, really helpful, and that point-in-time training. So it's not just, the ongoing training where we teach resist, but it's that point-in-time training right before somebody goes into an at-risk situation where you remind them, you help them sort of flex that muscle through examples and through the resist framework. Another instance where I think our approach is sort of proactive, tailored approach has been helpful is we are in constant contact with our businesses, and we try to make sure that we know what they're doing. And so, we had an instance yesterday where one of our creative types was requested to meet with a few foreign government officials, and we were concerned about the risk, and we didn't want that person to go into that meeting alone. So again, consistent with making sure that we shed transparency onto potential issues, we called one of our really cool lawyers in the at-risk jurisdiction because, again, these millennial creative types, the last thing they want is to go into a situation with, formal-looking lawyers. So we called up really cool lawyer, and we had this lawyer accompany our millennial creative type to these meetings, and they happened without incident. And it was in my opinion, I was very concerned about this meeting because it was not only in a country that was known for corruption, but the government official we had reason to believe was, there was potential there. So I think we managed the situation well.
Another key piece of the success in these stories, I think, is not just the training that you did, but the willingness of the employees and their ability to find the right person to talk to within the company. Because without that sort of open communication, you wouldn't have had the opportunity to intervene or assist in the way that you did.
And I think that goes to the relationships that we've built with our employees and the menu of channels that we have available to our employees.
Absolutely. Kevin?
There was someone who raised their hand. Not that I don't want to continue speaking, but I felt there was a question in the back.
Sure.
So these training programs are wonderful for employees that want to do the right thing and just need education. Have you found anything, as we're getting close to the kickoff here, for employees that are the bad apples? Either artificial intelligence, different ways of recruiting, vetting them out during the interview process, because these are all wonderful tools, presuming you've got good actors. What do you do about the people that are going to steal and make bad decisions no matter how trained they are?
I think that's a good question. I mean, I like to think that the vast majority of employees are good actors and not bad actors, and I think that approach to compliance is really important. You don't want employees to think automatically you view them as, culpable or criminal in any way. And also just from a corporate culture perspective, a lot of the employees who come to work for us are somewhat self-selecting. They really believe in our mission. They are consumers of our content, and they're committed to sort of doing the right thing. We don't actually have analytics in place right now to sort of identify potential bad actors, but oftentimes in these productions, people are not going into a situation alone or into these at-risk activities. They're not addressing these issues in isolation. And I think the fact that there are other people around who are watching and who care really help us in that regard.
Yeah. Katie, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I think it's really a really great question because it's sort of the future probably of compliance, which is predictive analytics. So we're trying to do more of this. We're piloting various examples like this. So one example I could cite is, so we have, I'm sure this is true for all of us, massive amounts of data. So how do you keep this from being a purely manual exercise? And as Mara just said, having these instances where someone seeks help and gets the right guidance, and she gets the right black turtleneck guy to go. Love that. Truly love that story. But, when you think about it, so we have over 300,000 employees, and there's not everything. We don't want them to be tethered to the point where they got asked for permission for things. It's just too much work, frankly, for the compliance function, the controllership function, all of us who have bigger things to do than to see whether they're really only spending X amount on what is facilitation payment or whatnot. So we have all of the what we call travel and living expenses data, and we have it, in algorithms whereby we can see who are the outliers. Like, if you look at somebody who never pops up on the screen because he's a huge spender one time, but in fact you see that this particular individual has spent a lot in smaller increments, but in ways that are really inconsistent with business practice. Why are they spending right below the limit multiple times a month, allegedly with a customer, in that particular jurisdiction or in that particular business? It starts not to make sense. We're able to see that now, and so that could be embezzlement. It could be pure theft from the company because by putting in the reimbursement slip, they're getting the money out. It could be, in the aggregate, an improper relationship, an inducement over time that, again, because it's under the radar, nobody sees it. So this tool was launched about 6 months ago for us. I've been working with our compliance organization to refine it, to have the right red flag considerations in there, because, of course, name, rank, serial number matters, band, what is their role? So trying to make sure we calibrate it. We won't catch everything, but it is a way of us discerning some people who we now focus on as high risk. And therefore, we're going to watch them more closely tomorrow, even if for the past 5 years they've never popped up on the screen. And likewise, we're going to do better training to make sure these guys and gals appreciate what the rules are, because is it conceivable? They don't know. It is conceivable. Maybe they're new employees, maybe from an acquisition. So we're trying to refine the data, what we're pulling out to make it meaningful, and then also refine our assessment of the risk. Not assume the worst, as Mara said. Oftentimes it's not with bad intent, but sometimes it may be. But that way we get smarter about both the preventive but also detection aspects of our program. And we very much view this as a wave of the future. So when I showed this tool in front of my team, it was like an amazing, wow for us. Because especially when you're investigating potential bribery offenses, this becomes very meaningful to know who is really spending the company's money in a way that is odd. And then we know where to drill down as opposed to boiling the ocean. So I just give that as one example.
And Kevin, I want to make sure we don't miss you on this, but part of your culture was shaped in a way by some enforcement issues that came up earlier in the time, right? So,
yeah, to the points that have been made already, I think so. Predictive analytics, I think that is going to be, if you look at the S curve of manufacturing and where things go, that's the next phase, and we're only starting to get to a point where it's useful for this type of information. And until that, so that's the strategy side. And I think the phrase is, I forget what the exact phrase is, but culture eats strategy for breakfast or whatever it is. Because culturally, that's the important thing. And if your culture isn't right, your strategy being as strong as it is, and you're still going to be, you're fighting, trying to boil the ocean, to use Katie's example. And so for Sharp, now my preliminary discussion was basically all of the potential problems you could have from a cultural perspective. So we had basically a splash of cold water in our face back in 2006 when the first DOJ subpoena arrived. It wasn't a corruption issue, it was an antitrust issue. And so we were working through those issues. It was industry-wide. It was a big problem. And culturally, no one saw what the problems were at that time. So we're working through the issues, and now we're at a point where this is maybe a month or two prior to the formal plea being announced by the DOJ that Sharp Corporation had entered into. Meanwhile, we had a case pending in Brazil, and somebody on the other side got up in the stand and testified that one of Sharp's personnel was involved in facilitating payments to an official in Brazil. Now, if that had happened 2 years prior, I don't know what would have happened. But because of our experience with the DOJ, because of the investigation that had gone on, there was immediate thought of this needs to be reported. And it sounds so simple. But culturally, we weren't there 2 years ago. The people there have started to change. The people who were responsible for some of the bad acts were gone. And as we started to adapt to these new methods, the reporting happened. And it happened very rapidly, and quick decisions were made with, again, from a consensus-driven company, really was a hard thing to overcome, but they got there. Now, as a result of that, we did an investigation. We disclosed to the DOJ, not that there was a problem, but that this allegation was made. We cooperated, whatever it is. There was no action taken as a result of it. But culturally, that was a very different position to be in than where we were. And it was driven by an awareness of this is a potential problem, not that this is an actual problem. And so, Mara, you were talking about some of the training you were done. I used to joke when I did FCPA training, particularly for a Latin American group, because our prior chief compliance officer had like a 45-minute presentation. And I used to joke, I'm going to go up there and put up one slide that says, don't bribe, period, and I'm going to sit down. And everyone's going to, and that was sort of my joke to say, everyone knows that. So why are there still problems? It's because it's a more nuanced conversation. And the cultural thing isn't that you're doing bad acts. It's, hey, if you see these types of things, don't be afraid to ask questions as to why. Ask questions to the people above, or ask questions to compliance personnel, be it within the legal department or within the compliance function, wherever it may be, because, to everyone's point, most of the time there are valid business reasons why certain things are happening. But you don't necessarily know that at first blush. And sort of questioning whether or not something's okay just raises an awareness culturally that there's a questioning of whether or not things are okay. And that you want issues to burble, is that even a word? Bubble to the surface? Maybe. It works, right? And so that's the cultural aspect. And that for me is how our company sort of has changed our culture. Right. And we help to drive. You can do the timing when I started within the legal department as to when all this stuff started to happen. So that's kind of that's my experience, at least anyway. So I've lived with it. I've seen it from one moving to another, and we are in a much better position now. All the training helps, but culturally, they have to just the awareness of the ability or willingness to ask those questions and figure out things are okay.
Okay, just very quickly, you said one of the aspects of GE's culture is that it's very acquisitive. And part of the challenge, of course, is integrating new business units into the company. Are there times when the company has learned from the culture of a unit it's acquired?
Oh, without a doubt. And I think where we can get in trouble is if we have the arrogance to believe that ours is the only way. First of all, you turn everybody off. Who's going to come in wanting to work for the company if they feel like they're being looked down upon? So just as an HR matter, that doesn't work. And there's a reason why they succeeded before, which is why we wanted to buy the company or form a joint venture. So again, it's much more nuanced. Even companies that have had major problems, and I'll cite Alstom as an example, has had an excellent EHS program. We've learned from how they manage environmental risk and regulation. I think of another company that we acquired by our healthcare business that was extremely good at regulatory for that particular space. So, and in fact, we learned from that because we stripped it down a bit. we thought, oh, we're good at regulation in this space. But of course, we were buying a brand new business that, the product of which we didn't have before, and we had to tweak it back because once we realized that we had, in this integration effort, had reduced down headcount because we felt that we were managing this risk area well enough, we realized it wasn't true, and so we had to build it back and eat a little crow, right? I mean, this is really about they knew what they were doing. We thought we did, so it wasn't done in bad faith. But it's always an assessment of what is good that we're inheriting. And no matter what, we also always want to find good to inherit because to rebuild a whole program from scratch, you're going to cut things that you don't need to. So there's waste involved, and there is impact on the employee base. You don't want to turn off that employee base that's very proud of that business. When you acquire them, they're already nervous whenever anybody's in an acquisition. So trying to find the good and then I think the biggest challenge is just making sure it's integrated in. Because if each acquired business has its own separate compliance program, there isn't a consistency, there isn't an integration between as a whole. And then later on when there are problems, should there be a problem, being able to analyze what happened gets harder because they don't have the standard spirit and letter program that we have across the whole. So we let each business, ours is not really top down, even for legacy G businesses. The businesses build their programs from the bottom, but it is within a framework. So if you think of acquisitions the same way, which is let them build with the assistance of an experienced G compliance leader, controller, finance manager, whatever it may be, then you're hoping to get the best of both.
Do you want to take with our last few minutes?
So, yeah, I mean, we have like maybe 1.5 minutes left. It's a sign I think we had a good discussion going on. So I think we could use that for question. If there's another question from the audience, we could see any hands raised, and we have one here. Great.
Is your anti-corruption program under your ethics and chief ethics and compliance officer, or is it in the legal department, or separate together?
So structural question: how are you guys structured?
The chief compliance officer used to report up through Japanese local management. Over time, the Japanese local management determined that they were not good at managing U.S. personnel and decided, where is he going to go now? And they saw me and they said, he comes to you anyway, so now he reports to you. So now the compliance function, and then eventually did the same with internal audit. So, yeah.
And Mara, for Univision?
Sure. So Univision, the chief compliance officer, owns our anti-bribery and anti-corruption program, and I report into the general counsel with a dotted line to the audit committee.
And I'm in legal, and our compliance program also rolls up into legal.
Okay. I think we'll time for one more, sure. No one's kicking us out of the room yet.
Can you comment at all on the types of issues you're seeing bubble up? I mean, everybody knows that they shouldn't be exchanging cash in an envelope, but where are those nuances that are bubbling up?
So what do you guys see?
I think part of identification of people, like who is this person, and are they a government official or not? I mean, that's kind of one which surprised. I mean, just domestically, we were selling a photocopy machine and two displays to local businesses, so you don't think anything of it. But this happened to be the consulate of Mexico. And we're looking at, and they were questioning whether they could give free items. The question was raised, can we give free items to the consulate of Mexico for this? And I was like, that shows a remarkable ability to recognize there's a potential issue because, A, you recognize the payment issue, and the fact that they're technically a foreign government at that point. So what I've noticed then is it's because you're right, everyone knows not to bribe, but the question is whether or not this person is or is not a government official, what makes this bad versus needing a permit to actually film someplace. That seems to be something that would be normal, right? I mean,
in that instance, that sounds almost impossible to do. And the average employee, so you have to get to that level.
I mean, so for me, it's always been a question of until I feel comfortable, and for the most part, these aren't. Depends where you are. In the U.S., it's fairly easy to figure out, obviously. In Latin America, it becomes very complicated, and so my default sort of reaction is, unless I feel comfortable that they're not, I'm just going to assume that they are, and therefore these payments. And so generally, I say, we're not making the payment, and that generally burbles. Again, I use that word again.
We've all learned something today, which is the word burbles. But there's I just point out there's a sort of a factual and a legal aspect to the question you raised. That is, are they a government official? in terms of what are they doing, and then there's a legal question under the FCPA, and there might be under other foreign privacy statutes as well, where so there's multiple components to that. So the legal function is absolutely going to be involved in that question, as well as the steps you need to take to determine who this person actually is and who they actually represent.
I was thinking about it more from a business standpoint, because as he said, it's a slippery slope in Mexico, and we're trying to look into the backgrounds of everybody you deal with, dealt with. The cost would be astronomical if you didn't look at, is there a threshold that you have so that you're not spending too much and you're not underperforming? I hope you answer that.
So we're out of time, but thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks to our panelists.
Thank you.